Okay, so welcome to BCP Eastern Planning Committee for the 19th of March 2026. If we can start with housekeeping, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Please note that this meeting is being recorded by the Council for live broadcast and will be published on the Council website for a minimum of 6 months. The meeting may also be recorded or streamed for live or subsequent broadcast by members of the public. For those in the room, please note if the fire alarm sounds, please exit the building by way of the nearest available signed fire exit route and make your way to the assembly point at the War Memorial in the gardens opposite the front of this building. Finally, please ensure background noise is kept to a minimum and mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. For those in the room, this includes turning off microphones and turning the volume down completely on your laptops. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So we'll move to the agenda, and item 1 is apologies, please.
Thank you, Chair. We've received apologies from Councillor Michael Tarling and there are no substitute members.
That's great. Okay, so I'm Councillor Paul Hilliard. I'm the chair of the committee, and I'll ask the people around the table to answer who they are.
I'm Councillor Marion Le Pedvin, Councillor for Newtown and Heatherlands Ward, and I'm Vice Chair of Committee.
Joe Salmon, Councillor for Moordown Ward.
Councillor Felicity Rice, Councillor in Oakdale Ward.
Patrick Callanan, Councillor for Boscombe West.
Gillian Martin, Councillor for Boscombe West.
Councillor Joe Clements, Penhill Ward.
Toby Slade, Muscliffe and Stratton Park.
Councillor David Flagg, Burton Grange Ward.
Matt Gillett from Tobberwoods Ward.
Steve Davis, I'm the planning officer presenting the item today.
Julie Allington, Senior Planning Officer.
Simon Gould, Development Management Manager.
Rebecca Rhodes, Democratic Services Officer and Clerk to the committee today.
That's great. And there's some other officers which have joined online from specialist areas of transport and policy if we need to call on them. Okay, so item 3 is declarations of interest. Councillor Salmon?
So I called in the first item for discussion, so I'll recluse myself for that one and speak as the ward councillor.
Okay, so you remain in the chamber for that, but outside the committee. Thank you. Okay, item 4 is confirmation of minutes for the meeting held on the 19th of February 2026. Are you happy that those to be agreed?
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. That's agreed. Item 5 is public issues. So after officer presentation, we will hear any public speakers, followed by any ward councillors. And then that leads us to item 6, which is schedule of applications. And 6A is Westover Retail Park. So Mr. Davies.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is an application for a Lidl supermarket on the former site of the Pizza Hut and Cotswold. It's a retail park at the junction of, you can see it on the Ordnance Survey map there. It's at the junction of Wimborne Road and Castle Lane West. This is an aerial view of the property, and you can see on the left-hand side, you've got the Cotswold store. On the bottom of the image, you can see the Pizza Hut restaurant, and there are a couple of other retail units in the middle of the screen there. You can see the units are laid out on the outside of the site with a central parking area. The main access is off of Wimborne Road. This is a image of what they're proposing on the site, and you can see it's a large retail food store tucked on the Castle Lane West frontage. The yellow area is the sales area, and the areas below it are the warehouse and bakery and other ancillary areas. They're providing a large car park, and as I said earlier, you can see that the existing access is used. That access is opposite the Grove, or is it in Moordown? This is a more detailed look at the layout, and you can see, as I said earlier, the internal sales area at the top and the other ancillary areas. They're providing quite a few parking spaces, bike parking areas, disabled parking, and I think they've got some electric charging points as well. This is a picture of the proposed elevations. The top elevation is the one that you'll see from the car park as you come in, and the other important one to look at is the one that's third down, and that's the elevation from Castle. The second one down is the elevation from Castle Lane West. This is, as members will be aware from the report, this is an amended application. The application came before members last year, and they've been working on a revision. This is the scheme that was before members before, and as you can, if I just flick between the two, you'll see there's some subtle changes, but largely the design is very similar. And although there's been some slight modifications, and importantly, it's slightly smaller than the previous scheme. Chair, this is some street scene elevations, and the elevation at the top is the view that you'll get from Castle Lane West. One of the important factors about the application is they need to raise the level of the site. So you'll see much more in the way of retaining walls along the Castle Lane frontage, but that is broken up with some landscaping, and they're also providing a new pedestrian access. The image below shows the relationship to the bungalows in Lawford Rise at the rear, and I'll come on to that later on, Chair. There's a complete redevelopment of the site, and unfortunately none of the existing landscaping can be kept, which is there are some fairly sort of semi-mature trees on the site, but they are replacing landscaping that they're taking out with some new planting, and the green areas show that there's quite a significant amount of greenery provided on the outside of the site. Chair, one of the reasons that the application was refused last time was that the members felt that the site didn't use the site efficiently, and given the council's concern with housing figures generally in the borough, members felt that they should go towards providing a mixed use on the site. The applicant has provided 3 potential options to show why they don't think that residential can be achieved on the site. This option here shows some semi-detached properties along the Wimborne Road frontage. As you can see, there's not much garden space provided for those units, and it does eat into the car parking on the site. Another option would be to provide a standalone block of flats on the corner. You can see it in the image below in yellow. Again, that would similarly eat into the parking on the site. And this is the third option, Chair, where they're providing some flats on top of the existing store. That doesn't affect the existing car parking, but it does put a greater demand on car parking, and it's much more dominant and overwhelming to the property, to those bungalows at the back in Lawford Rise. Chair, this is an image that they provided of the new store, which I hope puts it in perspective. I'll come back to that later on. This is another image which shows quite importantly the relationship to the properties below that area there in Lawford Rise. This is an image that you'll see from Castle Lane, from the traffic light junction as you're approaching. You can see they are providing some landscaping. That point there would be, if you were standing there today, you'd see the Pizza Hut restaurant. That's now being demolished, so you'll get a large car parking area and some trees and landscaping, and the store provided in the rear section. This is a photograph of the Castle Lane frontage as it is at the moment. You can see there's a fairly low retaining wall with some landscaping in it. And I just make the point, Chair, that because of the levels, they will be the base level of that car park will be raised by about 50%. So you'll have a larger retaining wall structure at that point. Chair, this is a photograph which we can go back to later if members need to, which shows those bungalows at the back in Lawford Rise, and you can see the current aspect that they've got. So, Chair, if I just go back to the main photograph there, and if I can now set out what we consider are the important issues on this site. As I said, the application was refused last year for two principal reasons. The first reason was that it was considered, as I said earlier, that they should make more efficient use of the site and perhaps incorporate some residential use to meet our housing targets. The other reason, Chair, was that the transport officer was seeking a dedication of land along Castle Lane so that they could provide a wider and better cycle route. That cycle route goes east-west across Castle Lane, and this is a bit of a missing link, and there was an opportunity here our transport officers felt to provide a much better and safer cycle route at this point. So initially Lidl weren't happy to provide that, but in this amended scheme they have now provided the land. So as you look at our recommendation, there is a requirement that they give us that land, dedicate that land to us, so that we can then improve the cycle route at that point. So that reason for refusal, Chair, has been overcome. Going back to the main issues, this is it's already a retail use on the site, and it's an established retail use. So the Lidl store is a replacement of retail that's there at the moment. They're not creating a new out-of-centre retail destination. The previous refusal, as I said, related to the mixed use and efficient use of land. There were no objections, members, to the design or amenity. When members considered the last application, there was an emerging local plan which included two critical policies. One was that this site should be identified as a specific mixed-use site, and the other policy related to the requirement for a retail impact assessment, which was lower than the standard threshold in the National Planning Policy Framework of 2,500 square metres. However, as members will be aware, that policy has now been withdrawn, so we can have no regard to the policies that were available at that time. However, we still have the MPPF, and Section 11 of the MPPF relates to effective use of land, and this is still an important material consideration, particularly given the Council's concern with significant housing pressures and limited land supply that we have. So I think that's an important factor that members need to be aware of when they consider this application. As I said earlier, with regard to the mixed use, the potential has been explored, but we have asked for advice from the highways officer on those three options that are put forward, and the highway and operational evidence shows that those schemes aren't easily deliverable, and therefore we consider that they shouldn't be given overriding weight. Chair, the other issue that was important when we considered the last application, and has been raised by the ward councillor, is the design and visual impact. I think it's important to say that the new scheme hasn't introduced any new design changes. It's very similar to the previous scheme. it's slightly different arrangement of windows, and the building on the rear elevation is marginally higher. But in terms of its massing and form, it's very similar to the earlier proposal. And I'd remind members that previously that application wasn't refused on design grounds. The urban design officer still has some reservations about the design of the building on the Castle Lane frontage. And if you look at the, let me show you. If you look at that area there, Chair, that's quite an important visual point. It's opposite Muscliffe Lane. It's a prime street frontage. And although the applicant has provided some new windows in that elevation, the urban design officer is concerned that you can't look into the building. So in effect, you're looking at what is a relatively blank side elevation. However, although we have tried to get them to provide more interest in that elevation, and in fact you'll see that they are providing some public art there, they're providing lots of landscaping, they're unable to provide a building that you can look into with windows, mainly because of the operational requirements of a supermarket. You need to have freezers and backing onto those outside walls. So, Chair, in terms of balancing the issue of whether or not this is an acceptable design, we think we've gone far enough to produce a design that is acceptable with the landscaping and the public art. Chair, the issue of scale, massing, and amenity, as I said earlier, the building is marginally bigger, and if you look at this area, this part of the building here, it's slightly higher, but we're only talking about 300 mil higher, and we consider the distance to the boundary is acceptable. So in terms of impact on amenity, if I can give you yeah, this is probably a better one to look at. We did have some reservations about the outlook from the properties in Lawford Rise. As I said, at the moment they've got a fairly open aspect. They'll now have a fairly large building along their rear boundary. However, having said that, as you can see from that image, they are proposing to put some planting in there. In terms of loss of daylight, it would meet the criteria for impact in that respect. So none of the, strange enough, none of the residents have objected, but obviously, we need to consider the effect on their amenity in any event. And in some respects, they'll be protected from the noise and nuisance of a car park. So on balance, Chair, we feel that the scale, massing, and impact on amenity is acceptable. Your environmental health officer has looked at the scheme quite carefully. They're satisfied that all of the plants can be designed in such a way that it won't cause a nuisance to neighbours. We've put conditions on about servicing and lighting, and so therefore, in terms of amenity, we're satisfied that the proposal will meet our will be acceptable. And as I said before, that issue wasn't raised as a concern by members before. In terms of highways and traffic, that's an issue that has also been raised by some of the representations. But I think the point here that is important is that there's less floor space, retail floor space, than there is on the site at the moment, and fewer car parking spaces. Because of the nature of a supermarket, it's potentially going to be busier. But our highway officer has modelled the impact on the local highway network, and is satisfied that that there won't be any serious concerns. The highway officer is here, Chairman, if members have got any specific questions about that. So, as I said, although it'll be busier at times, the modelling shows that there's no severe impact, which is the MPPF test. And the highways raise no objection. subject to the conditions, and also the subject to the dedication of land, which will be a great benefit to the highway network. And they're also making some highway contributions to a crossing across Wimborne Road, in case people want to access the site across the wide part of Wimborne Road. And they're also putting some money into some real-time information for the bus stop that's nearby. Yeah, the other issue which wasn't raised as a member concerned by members last time is the retail impact. As I said earlier on, the test in the NPPF is that if you've got a development that's more than 2,500 square metres of retail area, you've got to do a retail impact assessment to see what the effect of that would be on nearby retail centres. It's below the threshold, but because of the concerns raised, we had previously gone to our retail consultants and asked them for a view on whether or not it would have an impact. The other issue is whether or not sequentially there are other sites closer to shopping centres that would be a better site for this food superstore, so food supermarket. We've done a sequential test, and there's no nearby sites that would be better suited. In terms of trade diversion, the impact of this store on the other nearby centres is relatively low. It's between 3.7% to 1.3% of trade diversion. That is of no significant harm to those local centres. We've also had regard to the cumulative impact of other nearby developments. That's been looked at by Lichfields. And again, in terms of retail impact, we're satisfied that this is acceptable, meets the NPPF policies, and wouldn't cause significant harm to other retail centres. A new issue that was raised that wasn't relevant last time is biodiversity net gain. As you can see, they're taking away quite a lot of the existing greenery that's on the site, but they are replacing it, and they've gone through the process of the BNG metric, and they are providing 10% plus of biodiversity net gain on this site, and they're doing that through better landscaping, better ecological enhancements, and also they're putting in some fairly big semi-mature trees, which will provide an instant ecological benefit on the site. It's obviously important that ecology and benefits on the site is managed, and they will need to agree a fairly detailed management condition on the site. And if, for example, those large trees that they put in die, we will make sure that they're kept. And there obviously is a requirement under the legislation for those enhancements to be monitored for 30 years. So that will happen. Chair, as you can see, and we had a letter through which I've circulated to members from Tesco's. They've obviously got some concerns on our recommendation to support this development. One of the points that they raise is that the local planning authority should be consistent in their approach, and having refused the application last time on the grounds of it not being an efficient development, we should equally refuse this development for not being efficient because they haven't got residential use on the site. As you can see from my report, we have gone through this process, and members aren't bound necessarily by previous decisions. They've obviously got to be aware of the decision they made previously, but they can then take account of new factors, and it's all part of the balancing of the issues in the recommendation. So, Chair, be mindful of the fact that we did refuse this before a mixed-use development, but you're not necessarily bound by it if you consider that there are some changes and benefits when you're balancing all of the other issues. The other issue that they've raised is that when we should have full regard to the MPPF in terms of the benefits of this site potentially for providing residential use. I think I've dealt with that with those options that they have put forward, and although it would be nice to try and achieve some residential use on this site, we don't think that it's feasible, having looked at the options that they've put forward. And say the MPPF, although it's suggesting that we should support mixed-use developments, when you consider the MPPF as a whole, it doesn't suggest that there should be residential on this site at all costs. So, Chair, in terms of the overall sort of planning balance, just to reiterate that Section 11 of the MPPF is recognised in our assessment of the application, and we have given it due weight. But the mixed use is not considered on balance feasible on this site. The design issues, it is a supermarket. It's not, it's a fairly boxy building, but we feel that they have made some enhancements on the Castle Lane frontage. They put in quite a lot of landscaping, and we are getting some public art on the site, which is tied up in a condition. So we consider that in terms of visual impact and townscape and streetscape, that it'll be a suitable building on this site, having regard to what's there at the moment. The provision of a new access, pedestrian access from Castle Lane to serve the Muscliffe estate, we consider is a real benefit for this site as well, and obviously the cycle route. So therefore, the highway and retail impacts are acceptable. We've secured biodiversity net gain, and our view is the proposal accords with the development plan when read as a whole. So our recommendation is to approve, subject to a Section 106 agreement, and conditions, specifically including highways and servicing requirements, the restriction on retailing so that they can't provide more options, so that they're tied to the specific use that they've got on this site. Landscaping, biodiversity, net gain, and public art. So, Chair, with that in mind, we're supporting the application.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Davies. So, Councillor Salmon, if I can ask you to.
Do I need to move
Yeah.
to the other end of the room?
So then we move to speakers then, please.
Thank you, Chair. So we have one person registered in objection, and that's Mr. Chris Hatch, and I will read that statement out on his behalf. So the junction which the proposed little store will feed entry and exit into is one of the major east to west routes. It is frequently busy and gridlocked. This will exacerbate the situation. Queues with all ways and with yellow box very often preventing traffic movement. Increased traffic will undoubtedly increase pollution, not contributing to net zero, regardless of cycling lane adjustments. Frequent deliveries to a store will add to that impact. I challenge any suggestion of economic benefit, low-paid jobs at best with no new money above what is already spent locally. It will lead to a dispersal of trade between stores with diminishing returns, and likely one or more will close. If online delivery is allowed, this will only lead to further increase in traffic and pollution. We have multiple supermarkets, mini markets, on-site fuel station shops, all within 5-mile radius. There are easily well in excess of 10 or more. This is not a question of need, but greed. Little at West Parley, but less than 2 miles away. Co-op within half a mile. Still important is the existing stores benefit, which do not generate as much traffic and have been there for decades. We have reached saturation point, although if Lidl feel they need another store in such close proximity to the other store at West Parley, there are vacant retail openings at Castle Point with the massive car park that have yet to be filled. There are, in addition, 2 sets of pedestrian lights which add to the traffic lights for traffic flow, all adding to the free flow of traffic anyway, and almost repeating the increased traffic would have massive impact. In short, there can be absolutely no justification to accept the proposal. And on behalf of the applicant, we have Mr. James Mitchell. If you want to pop up to the table, please. Philippe, when you're ready, you have the 5 minutes.
Thank you. Morning, members. My name's James Mitchell, Regional Head of Property for Lidl. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak to you this morning in support of our proposals. Majority of members will recall the previous scheme for this site, which was refused by members against officer recommendation in January 2025. The key reasons, as the officers had explained, for refusing at that time were the failure to dedicate land to facilitate cycling and pedestrian improvement works and the absence of a residential element as part of a mixed-use scheme. The scheme before you today now offers the land required for the highway improvement works, and this change, along with agreed Section 106 contributions for a new crossing on Wimborne Road, real-time information upgrades to local bus stops, as well as ample cycle parking for colleagues and customers, will ensure the site contributes positively to active travel aims and deals absolutely with this element of the previous reason for refusal. Your highways officers raised no objection to the new application. With regard to the committee's previous preference for the inclusion of residential within the scheme, this was in some part underpinned by the site's allocation for 40 dwellings in the emerging plan, as well as referencing efficient use of land as described by Chapter 11 of the MPPF. As members will of course be aware, the emerging plan has now been withdrawn, and as your case and policy officers both confirm, the former emerging plan now carries no weight whatsoever. Your officers have also fully considered the content of Chapter 11, and whilst this general guidance on making efficient use of development sites is a consideration, it does not usurp the core principle of the MPPF that applications that accord with the development plan should be approved. KC advice has been sought specifically on this point, and Senior Counsel confirms his agreement with this principle. Your officers have thoroughly considered this point and determined that any refusal on this ground would be unjustifiable. Despite this, Lidl has provided further information to illustrate that a mixed-use scheme cannot practically be delivered on the site. The incorporation of residential uses causes material issues relating to highway safety, under provision of parking, and overbearing impact on neighbouring properties, amongst other things. Your case officer and highways officers have considered these submissions and have now clearly concluded that this site cannot accommodate any supplementary uses. Away from the technical policy matters, I did also want to ensure members know the commercial reality of the situation with the site. Lidl do own the freehold of the property, and clearly it's our desire to develop the site and provide the proposed scheme along with its associated benefits. If we're unable to gain planning permission, the site will not be developed for residential use. This application is for a new retail scheme on a site currently in retail use, a scheme that accords with the development plan, as well as passing all relevant retail policy tests. The site does not have any sort of allocation requiring a mix of uses, and in our view, as such, should be approved. We are aware of yet another late representation from Tesco. This raises nothing new, and the supplementary report from your officer confirms that it's been fully reviewed and does not change the conclusion on the application. Considering comments made at committee for the first application, I'd again like to reassure members that this scheme will serve as a complement to our popular Winton store, which continues to perform very well and is amongst the most successful of our stores in the BCP area. I would urge members to consider the land dedication, sustainability, job creation, infrastructure improvements and ecology credentials of this new development, none of which are delivered by the existing rather tired retail park. Please also remember the overwhelming public support for the principle of a Lidl store on this site, as evidenced by over 4,300 residents supporting Lidl's redevelopment of the site during consultation on the first application. Considering all of this, I really do hope members can now support their officer's recommendation, which is again to approve and grant permission today. Again, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Mr Mitchell. Now we move on to ward councillors. Councillor Salmon, would you like to come up?
Thank you, Chair. I want to be really clear from the outset that I support the regeneration of this site, but this application still fails on two fundamental points: design and, more importantly, the use of land. So first on the design, it's a gateway site, sits at a major junction. Paragraph 135 of the MPPF requires development here to be visually attractive and to create a strong sense of place and to provide active frontages. This scheme doesn't do that. Castle Lane West elevation remains inactive, dominated by signage and blank walling. The building's still boxy and poorly articulated, and the council's own urban design officer continues to raise concerns, and notably, clearly, hasn't even been asked what an acceptable scheme for this site would look like. Landscaping and public art cannot fix what is a fundamentally weak building here. We are not required to accept mediocrity simply because what is there already is mediocre. My main concern, though, is the land use. So just over a year ago, this committee quite correctly refused a materially similar scheme. Now, no attempt has ever been made to appeal that decision, to overturn it, or to challenge it, because that decision was sound. It was valid. That decision relied on paragraph 11 and chapter 11 of the MPPF, not the emerging local plan. The withdrawal of that plan changes nothing about the basis for that refusal. There's been no change in national policy, no change in our housing crisis, no inspector or court has found that decision to be deficient. The bar for departing from that position should be very high, and that has not been met. The officer report itself exposes a really clear inconsistency. At paragraph 32, there's a recognition that the evidence base that made up that emerging local plan identified a clear housing need and a retail oversupply. Now, that evidence must still be given weight, and the report clearly says this. Yet in paragraph 59, the report seeks to limit the role of that same evidence by arguing it cannot be relied on in decision-making in the absence of policy. But those two positions do not sit together easily. Evidence is what should always inform planning judgment, and that evidence doesn't cease to matter, doesn't cease to exist because the policy is being withdrawn. And that evidence is really, really clear. We have a 2.1 year supply of housing, and we're significantly under delivering on our housing targets. At the same time, our retail and leisure study shows an oversupply of, I think, 10,000 square metres of retail floor space. There is no need for additional retail provision until 2033. Now, paragraph 128 of the MPPF is very explicit. In areas of high housing demand like ours, like this, we should always support the use of retail land for housing. This is exactly that kind of site. That is the reason for the decision in January. Now, we've been told that housing cannot be delivered here, but that's not been demonstrated. There's been no viability assessment. The only layouts tested have been the applicant's own indicative schemes, which were failed on parking and highway issues, which weren't even fully explored. Parking highways didn't say this is impossible, they said there were issues that needed to be addressed. The committee has not been shown that housing is impossible, only that the applicant doesn't wish to provide it. So we end up left with a single-use retail scheme on a site where housing is needed and retail is not, supported by a recommendation that departs from the committee's own recent considered judgment without sufficient justification. If I were on committee, I would be proposing refusal on the grounds of poor design, contrary to paragraph 135 of the MPPF and policy CS41, and the inefficient use of land, contrary to paragraph 11 and paragraphs 124 to 130 of the MPPF. For those reasons, Chair, I urge the committee to refuse this application.
Okay, thank you. If you could turn the microphone off, please.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Davies, is there anything from what you've heard from the speakers that you want to come back on first? Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. The only thing I'd remind members about it's the fallback position here. That the site is already has a character, and actually I think that the design improvements will make it a bit better visually than what's on the site at the moment. I accept it is a gateway site, and it would be nice to have a well-designed architectural masterpiece on that site. But I think the fallback position of where we are now and what's being proposed, I don't think it's sufficient to recommend refusal. The other issue is about the requirement of Chapter 11 of the MPPF, and obviously the evidence base. We all are fully aware of the fact that the council has got a housing shortage. That's a very important factor. But I think when you look at our development plan in terms of the policies, there are no specific policies that would indicate that this site should specifically be used for mixed use development. You know, there's no specific policy, and also I think that you must also be aware or cognizant of the fact that there's actually less retail on this site in terms of overall floor space than there is at the moment. So the fallback position is that you've got a fairly substantial retail floor space here. They're not increasing it. They're not introducing new floor space. In fact, they're slightly reducing it.
Okay, thank you for that. So members, questions at this stage? Okay, Councillor Snade.
It might just be, well, I'm sure it is a typo, but just something for the notes if we can. Tesco's further representation says application is 02224, but the committee report says it's 2274. I'm sure it's a typo, but can we note that? So there's no ambiguity later on that the letter didn't refer to anything else?
So are you talking about the... Jay, sorry, you're talking about the floor space at the...
sorry, no, so Tesco's letter that came in
Yes.
refers to application P250224, and our report refers to application 25-2274. So
yes.
I'm sure it's a typo, but can we just make sure that's clear? So
Yes, well, I think Tesco's objection obviously clearly relates to this current application, so we're aware of that, yes.
Thank you. Any other questions? Just for me, and it might be more relevant for Adrian on the traffic side, but could you just explain what type of modelling you do from what is at the retail park now, and how you do the modelling of expected journeys if it was a Lidl's? Thank you.
Chair, yes, I think probably Adrian can deal with this one better. I suppose what you're asking is that there's an existing retail use on the site and a proposed retail use on the site, but those retail uses are slightly different in terms of their traffic impact. So I hope that Adrian can cover that point.
Yes, good afternoon, members. Yeah, in terms of what has been submitted, it's materially similar to the previous application that obviously both the Highways Authority and members considered acceptable, with the exception of the land dedication. But obviously the major part of that submission is the transport assessment, which we've analysed in detail. And essentially the two things that we look at here would be the site access junction on Wimborne Road, and just to give you an idea of the figures we're talking about, we've got junction modelling for two different junctions, you see. So the junction modelling for the site access would equate to, I do have it here. So we're expecting 33 to 52 new vehicle movements across. This is obviously weekday and weekend peak time. So this is not spread out through the day, which would be reduced. But that'd be an average increase of one vehicle movement from the site every 1 to 2 minutes. And that is, like I say, from the Wimborne Road site access, which in highway terms would be considered negligible. And then, as well as that, you've got obviously the nearby major traffic junction on the Castle Lane West Transport Corridor. And the difference between the busiest, essentially the transport modelling here would equate to the busiest junction arm, which would be the A3060 Wimborne Road Northwest and the Castle Lane West westbound internal. I appreciate this is quite hard to envisage without the view. Are expected to result in average queue increases of 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 passenger car units, respectively, and that's again across peak hours. So yeah, extended queue lengths of this time only at peak hours it would be considered to have a negligible effect. It doesn't have a direct material impact on the operational safety of the traffic junction in that location. And in terms of overall increase in traffic on the surrounding highway, if we look at DFT, Department for Transport statistics on the Castle Lane West Transport Corridor, we're expecting around 22,800 vehicular movements, average daily flow there, and the additional trip gen from this site would equate to less than 3% of an increase on those flows. And that's also considered future or reasonable future scenarios, which, as per the MPPF, is required, and that wouldn't constitute a severe residual cumulative impact, which would be unacceptable to the Highway Authority.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Kemp. That's useful. Right, Councillor Rice.
I don't know if the transport officer is the right person to ask about this as well, but just in terms of the pedestrian access, looking at the visualizations, it's a zigzag going from the Castle Lane West up into the raised site. It doesn't look very direct in terms of being able to get up there with a double pushchair or in a mobility scooter. And my understanding is that that type of hairpin bend is not best practice in terms of accessibility. So I just wondered that I can see that there is possibility there to have a direct sort of straight line access, which would also enable a cycle access off the proposed new cycle lane that will be built there as part of the strategic network. So it just wonder if there's any comments on that. It looked like poor design.
Mr. Davis.
Okay, yes, I think people in Bournemouth should be used to zigzags really with our with our access to the sea. But no, I do take the point that you've made. They could create a longer ramp, which would be, but because of the difference in levels, that has been considered to be the most practical way of dealing with it.
Is there any comments from a sustainability or accessibility officer on that? I couldn't see anything myself in the report.
No, under building regulations, they would need to meet the accessibility requirements.
They may not meet best practice.
There's been no adverse comment raised on this application from an accessibility point of view. But as I say, because of the difference in levels, that is the only practical route. So there are other ways to get into the site. You know, if you don't need to use that zigzag, you could go around the footpath and into the main access. I know it's less convenient, but I think that's the most practical way of accessing this site.
Can I come back? Would you also be able to explain why this site needs to be raised? Obviously, it has huge impacts on the ability to have housing on top of the site if it's already raised by almost a story, and it has huge impacts on the urban design aspect of it because you're creating a big bulk with, which we've already been told is an issue.
Yes, Chair. At the moment, the site has a slight crossfall to it, so the car park's got a slight crossfall to it. They're not raising the level of the site significantly, but what they're doing is they're trying to take out a little bit of that crossfall, mainly because this is a supermarket with trolleys, and if you're shopping in the back, you let go of your trolley. If it's too steep, the trolley will run into somebody else's car. So it's a practical reason for doing that.
And was there any exploration of reducing the level rather than to make it flat on one side rather than raising it on the other side, which has implications for accessibility?
There is, as I say, there's still a crossfall. So if the problem is if you were to make it flatter, then you'd have a really steep access in, and that wouldn't be very safe. So the high point is on Wimborne Road, opposite the junction with the Grove there, and the low point is obviously off to the left. So there is a crossfall there. So you know, if you were to make it flatter and drop the level of the car park, you'd have a very steep ramped access off of Wimborne Road, and that would be unsafe as well.
Okay, Councillor Canavan.
Thank you, Chair. Two questions. One hopefully will be fairly straightforward. I'm just wanting to understand, Lidl's have confirmed that they own the freehold of this land. So in terms of the cycle lane that they're prepared to dedicate that land for that purpose, I'm just wanting to understand how that works. Is that a legal agreement or is it a section 106?
Yes, Chair, it'll be part of the 106 agreement. If they implement this consent, they will have agreed to dedicate the land to us.
Okay, thank you. So my second question is, I would just like to understand a bit better what assessment we've made about the viability of using this site for as a mixed site. I understand what you've said about the representations that you've had from highways and all of that argument, but what seems to me from the slides that you showed was that the indicative designs that Lidl had suggested as a way of demonstrating that a mixed use or residential property on the site wasn't viable didn't actually do anything to, as I see it, didn't actually do anything to the shape of the supermarket itself. What they were seeking to do, from my perspective, was to try and put some residential property on the other bits of the site without adjusting the site of the supermarket itself. I hope that's right. So the question that leaves in my mind is, could a mixed site development, residential property on that site be viable if the design of the supermarket itself was changed? And I'm just wanting to understand the degree to which we've tested that ourselves, rather than just relying on Lidl's designs and the input from the highways.
Yes, Chair, I think the important factor here is that clearly you could provide a mixed use development on this site with commercial and with residential, and you could make it work. But unfortunately, and Lidl have only tested it with their model for a supermarket on the site. If there was obviously with the supermarket, it's got to be of a certain size to be viable to them, and it's got to have a certain amount of car parking spaces, and that's obviously highlighted by our transport engineers' advice as well. That they want sufficient car parking on the site. So in answer to your question, there are lots of different potential options for this site, but we've got to consider it, this application, on the basis of what's been submitted, and we as officers feel that on balance it is appropriate to have a supermarket on this site because it's an existing retail site. I don't think there are any other retailers out there, and we've got to consider this application as it is. We can't speculate at what might be suitable on this site. But I think the key is that we've got no specific local plan policy that requires us to have a mixed use development on this site.
Okay, thank you. So any other questions, notes? Councillor Rice?
I'd just like confirmation in terms of, so we haven't seen many options for what could have been put onto this site in terms of having housing as well as a Lidl's store. They've obviously given us some, but one of the main reasons that they've stated is the limited space for parking. But I just wanted to get confirmation that the transport team did confirm that that they potentially would not need to provide all of the parking that they've said, that Lidl's have said that they would need to provide, because it is in such a sustainable location. And I was just looking, it's 1.4 miles to a secondary school and less than a kilometre to a primary school. And it's obviously on a major bus route. So it does seem a very sustainable location. So I just wanted confirmation that that was the case.
Yes, Chair, it's probably something that Adrian would deal with better. And perhaps one other point that I didn't say before that perhaps is important is that obviously, you know, in my view, this isn't an ideal site for residential because of its proximity to quite busy roads and because it's going to be surrounded by commercial development. But having said that, the question you've asked is about parking, and I think it's probably best that Adrian can deal with this point.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Yes, Councillor, we did look at, or I personally did look at all three indicative proposals from the applicant for a mixed-use site. As the case officer rightly said, I can't. It's not my job to then reduce the size of the store or come up with other schemes. So purely on what I assessed that was in front of me, all three schemes would result in a very significant parking shortfall of somewhere between circa 20 and 53 or 54 parking spaces. Now, whilst there is a degree of flexibility in SBD standards with robust justification, there's certainly not that much leniency on it. When you have sites surrounding the application, when you have, sections of highway surrounding the application site, which are unrestricted in nature and obviously very well used by local residents, hence our concerns for exacerbated parking stress and the highway safety issues that come with that.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. Okay. So if that's the questions, we shall now go to debate. So obviously, looking at the previous application, grounds for refusal, the main one I think was the highways objection, which we heard land has been allocated for the cycle pedestrian way, so that takes it away. And then the other issue was about the mixed use. I think it's good that we have this time seen examples of where mixed use could come in, but as we've heard from the officer, there are standards, sizes of a little store, which they can't. This has been reduced from a previous application, so it shows that I think this is a base model for a little store. They can't reduce it to allocate more for mixed use. So on the face of it, I think they've addressed both the reasons for the previous refusal. Councillor Rice.
Yeah, I recall it slightly differently in terms of the cycle, the strategic transport infrastructure allocation was very, very important. However, the mixed use was also extremely important for the committee last time. And initially, I was pleased to see in the documentation that we were sent sort of alternative uses, some housing were placed in various different places, but on closer examination, they are not where I would have thought was a sensible place to have put housing. And it seemed to me that it was an attempt to demonstrate that they couldn't put housing on this site, but it wasn't a very serious attempt, as was highlighted by Councillor Salmon. And it's, just to highlight that one road along, there is a building there that is 4 stories high, and it's not very far away. And one of the reasons that we've been given by the case officer was that there's a busy road nearby. However, roads are changing all the time, and indeed, so for me, that wouldn't be a reason to think that this wasn't a good place to put some housing. We were given examples by the transport officer in terms of sort of a range of parking shortfall, but they were from the poor examples. So we've also heard from the case officer that it would be possible to have a mixed use on this site, although maybe not at Liddell's. I'm not convinced that this is making best use of this land, and I'm also very disappointed with that pedestrian access. Yeah, I at the moment I'm not convinced that I can support this as being the best use of the land.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Slate.
Thanks. I know we have got residents who don't support it, but it is on the corner of my ward. Having spoken to a lot of them, they are supportive of another scheme going there, retail scheme. They aren't as supportive of the high going up, another thing on top with residential. I know we've got mixed views, but it is a retail site. And so I'm speaking now on behalf of the majority of residents. I have had a handful say they're not supported by a significant number of others saying they would prefer it to remain retail, prefer to be a little site, and they're not supportive of residential above. There's the voice of the residents there.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Gillett.
In terms of taking on board Felicity's point that it's something of a straw man argument just to put the properties on as they are on the sort of those suggestions. Potentially it's not in front of us, but potentially they could have raised up the block of flats and had parking underneath it, and then they wouldn't have lost any parking spaces, or potentially the 6 semi-detached ones which were on the north end of the site didn't need to be there. Then they would only lose 14 spaces as opposed to 50 spaces in the car park. So I just sort of feel that they haven't demonstrated that it isn't available as a mixed use site. So what it then boils down to is, does this need to be a mixed use site, or does the planning application stand on its own from that perspective?
Okay, thank you. Councillor Rice.
Just coming back in terms of residents, we have a very nice developed site in Poole with an Aldi's with flats above it, and it's speaking to residents that are facing homelessness, sort of the option of being presented. I agree that having a Lidl's on this site is well supported, but I don't think residents have been given the option of having sort of, this is some nice accommodation for people that you know, families from your local school that are desperately looking for housing. Would you prefer that, or do you want what they're only offering? And I just feel that we have this opportunity to say, sort of, this is a European country. They have plenty of experience of building in stores whereby they they build on housing on top. So I just feel that they just need a little bit of a push, and we could end up with something better.
Okay, thank you. So any other? Councillor Martin.
I'm inclined to disagree. I just think I can see the point about mixed use, but I think it would be a jolly miserable place to live. And I think sometimes we've become obsessed with shoving more homes in, and we don't think about the actual infrastructure. And I think a store in this location, the size of the store, is perhaps better for the residents that are existing there. The residents on Norfolk Rise, none of those have objected, which I'm surprised that's actually quite. I think if they had to cope with the height of the building and flats on top, I think that would make it jolly miserable for them. I don't think it's a good location for housing anyway, because it's on a corner. I would be in support of it. Now, I think the other thing is a strong sense of place. We are becoming sort of more European now, and a little store is part of British life. You know, it's people accept it. So the other thing is they are the freeholders. Lidl's own the freeholds, and then they're not obliged to build homes. They're not obliged to develop it. They could just leave it as it is. So we're not we're not losing anything. We're not, you know, we're not losing anything by granting permission, because they're not obliged to build houses anyway. It's their land.
Okay, thank you. I think we've had mixed views as always at the committee, so it's difficult. So if no one else is going to say it, Councillor Rice.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify as well. In terms of the contribution to the crossing, there's a £50,000 contribution. That's not going to actually fund the crossing, is it? That's just going to be a contribution. I just wanted to clarify that there won't be a crossing produced from this development until the local authority resolves the shortfall.
Okay, Mr. Kemp, did you want to come in with that answer on the crossing?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's a contribution towards crossing infrastructure that we will facilitate in getting in place post development. That obviously alone would not be enough for a certain type of crossing, but it will be crossing infrastructure in the future once we have the funds in place.
So would you be able to put like a timescale on it? So if it did, if the store did proceed, how long after that would you expect a crossing to appear?
It's hard to put an exact timescale in, but we can obviously hold the funds for, you know, a reasonable amount of time, you know, many years. But yeah, we'd hope it would be obviously, let's say within a couple of years, but that would depend on other matters.
Okay, no, thanks for that guidance. So if there is no other speaker, I will propose, as set out from the chair, to approve the application. As I said, I think it's before us because of a tight balance. Obviously, the road, the cycle infrastructure, that's the positive. The mixed use hasn't come forward, but this time at least we've had an explanation of possible scenarios, and our officers have sort of supported why those scenarios haven't been able to come up, mainly because of the parking needs, both for retail and for residential use, and because of the site, it is on those busy lanes. The style of the building, it's very similar to the Lidl's around my way in Christchurch. They are boxes by definition. The windows and panellings do break it up a bit, and the trees will break it up a bit. But again, another positive I think this time is the solar panels. So it is a sustainable development. So yeah, I propose as set out. So anyone to second? Councillor Slade?
I'll second you.
Okay, that's good. Any other debate on the proposal? Councillor Flagg?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm happy to support the proposal. My only concern is the plant equipment at the rear of the premises, and I know the acoustic report sets out that there'll be a barrier, etc. But I would like to think that environmental health keep on top of any issues that the residents may have there. Perhaps with they may have to look at providing a plenum chamber or whatever to keep that noise down, because it's quite close to the residents in the adjacent road there.
Thank you, Councillor Flagg. Yeah, I think I saw a condition, something about the rear aspect. So any other debate? No. Okay, so we shall now go to the vote. So the application is to approve as set out. So if you show now, if you're to approve.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
To refuse, show now.
1.
And abstentions.
2.
So that application is approved as set out. So thank you for your time there. That is the final part of the agenda, so the meeting is now closed. Thank you.